So a lot of you out there, being the avid readers I know you are, probably are already aware of the fact that you may be turning readers off of your book before they've even read past page 1. That's right, you have probably about 5 minutes to not only show the reader that your book is worth buying, but for it to also be written in such a way that they'll want to read past the first sample chapters. And in 2024, 5 minutes might be a little too generous. So in this video, I'm going to discuss 4 things that will have potential readers skipping over your work and going after somebody else's. So let's get into it. Hello everyone, as is usual, I'll get introductions out of the way. I'm Aaron Dusk, welcome to my channel. I am a self-published author of 2 books out right now, The Mark of Emuli and The Varcross Key. You can check those out in the links below. If you want to learn more about me and my writing, check out theliteratebeast.com. And if you like my content, consider subscribing to my channel, and if you like my writing, consider supporting me financially on Patreon. It helps a ton. So now that that's out of the way, let's get into the easy stuff first. Before anyone bothers to crack open your book, there are 3 things that may kill a reader's interest. So the first one would be a terrible book cover design. As I've said many times, and I'll keep saying it over and over again, looks are important. And it doesn't matter if you're selling a product or going to a job interview. If your presentation is crap, no one is going to want what you're selling. An ugly book cover design is one of the main repellents in the self-publishing space. I mean, take a look at a lot of self-published books out there, especially like go to Twitter, go to #WritersLift, and take a look at a lot of those book covers, and you'll see what I mean. They have a certain quality about them that you can tell was probably self-made. And it doesn't matter if the book is probably one of the best things ever written. If the book cover's ugly, that's it. You know, you've only got that one chance, and the cover is your first and most important form of advertising, and it's not something you should skimp on. I just realized I had my fan on, so bad habits die hard, I guess. So the second thing that may turn a potential reader away would be a poorly written title, or just a bad title altogether. So even if the cover caught the reader's attention, a bad book title may also work not in your favor. Now, sometimes bad titles are a part of the appeal for certain writers. For example, just about any book title by the author Chuck Tingle. It's not supposed to be serious. It's supposed to be of a certain quality that people expect, or his readers expect. But if you're wanting to draw readers in, the title should match the theme of the book. So if, for example, your book is about a werewolf that ruins a college graduate's life, then you might try using the title, When Life Gives You Werewolves. Okay, so that's a title from one of my upcoming books, but you get the idea. The title should catch the reader's attention, and it should match the tone and the theme of the genre that you're writing in. And it shouldn't be ridiculously long or confusing. And number 3 would be a poorly written blurb. This is quite literally the last barrier to entry that you will need to pass a reader's tests before they crack open your book. Some readers don't read blurbs and are simply interested in the book by the cover or the title. But the vast majority of readers out there want to know what they're getting themselves into. So some example of poorly written blurbs would be ones that can't give a reader a clear picture of what the book is about in under 200 words. Ones that have poorly written sentences or misspelled words, which, by the way, if you're misspelling words in your blurb, that's a huge red flag that will immediately get a pass by readers. And then, you know, another poorly written blurb would be one that's way too long that spoils a lot of the book or isn't really all that interesting to hook a reader. Blurbs should leave the reader wanting to know more, but not be completely confused or bored. So how to fix all of these things will be a topic for another video, but let's say that you've passed this test with flying colors and your book is luring in readers like bears to honey, but no one sticks around long enough to, either buy your book or review your book. So you've just come across the fourth barrier to your book's success, and that is a weak or bad beginning. Now, the beginning, middle, and end of your book are very important. But if a reader got to the middle of your book, it means that the beginning was strong enough to lure them there. This is why the beginning of a story is the most important part of it. So I've spent years trying to figure this out, and what I've come up with is 5 tips to writing beginnings to not only draw a reader into the story, but also keep them there long enough to where they get to the middle of the story. So the first tip is to keep your reader asking questions. I've brought this up so many times in past videos, but once you figure this out, it becomes a no-brainer. So whenever, a booktuber or an author tuber or even an editor that gives advice on writing says to hook the reader, that can mean just about anything. But when you drill down into the details of what they're asking or what they're saying to do, and it's really just about getting the reader interacting with the story passively enough to ask questions that they want answers to. So when you write the very first sentence of a story, ask yourself if this gets the reader's attention and is interesting enough to get them asking questions about what's going on here. So I'll give you an example of an opening sentence that really caught my attention. There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he deserved it. This is an opening from The Voyage of the Dawn Treader from the Narnia series. I never really cared much for these stories, but look at that perfect first sentence, okay? So it paints so many pictures in your head right now about who this character might be. And it even gets you asking, what kind of shitty things is the author hinting at that Eustace may have done? So tip number 2, and this is just as important as tip number 1, it's putting your inciting incident as close to the beginning as you possibly can. There is nothing that bores a reader faster than going through nearly 50 pages without knowing if anything of interest is going to happen anytime soon. Has the character done anything or had anything happen to them that actually starts the story? If by the end of chapter 1, I've only seen your character wake up and get dressed, talk to a few friends and faff about for 4,000 words, I'm going to feel like my time has just been wasted. Readers want a story, not a character doing a laundry list of things before the actual story starts. If nothing interesting is happening to the character, then you're boring the reader. Readers don't care what your excuse or your artistic vision may be. If they're bored, that's a DNF. End of discussion. Tip number 3, and this is going to be kind of a controversial one, but one that's really important, especially to people who are querying their manuscript to agents. And that is, if you're new to writing, try to avoid prologues. I could have taken my own advice with this, considering I put a prologue at the beginning of the Mark of Amuli. Why? Well, I thought it was needed, but to be honest, I could have just started with chapter 1. Or I could probably have fit that prologue somewhere into chapter 1 in a way, and just made it its own scene. Now, granted, it didn't overstay its welcome, and it was only about 2 pages long, but it really wasn't necessary to put in. If you're self-publishing, obviously you can do whatever the hell you want. If you know how to craft an interesting prologue, then knock yourself out. If you're querying agents, however, as a new author, and you're unsure of how to make your prologue not read like one giant world-building info dump, then do yourself a favor and leave it out. Whenever I'm beta reading or critiquing another writer's story, if I see a prologue, it usually means I'm in for a pretty rough read. I have not been wrong yet, by the way. And I think this is why a lot of agents will outright reject a manuscript with a prologue. Does it happen all the time? Well, no, of course not. There are always exceptions to the rules. Does it happen enough that literary agents and traditionally published authors will advise new writers against it? Oh, you betcha. One thing aspiring writers will learn very quickly in this industry is that they're not special snowflakes. When we're new and we haven't accomplished anything yet, there are rules for us that may not apply to more established authors. When you put anything out there as an unproven writer, you want to make sure that your work has the best chance of succeeding. Sometimes that means giving up the things you want to keep. You may have heard the phrase, kill your darlings. Well, it almost seems like it was made specifically for prologues sometimes. Now, am I telling you to never write a prologue? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. And despite all the debates and hate that prologues seem to garner, I do believe they are there for a specific type of reader. Am I one of those types of readers? Absolutely not. If I see a prologue in a fantasy book, I usually skip right over that sucker. And because that information is usually going to be sprinkled throughout the book anyways in the world building. I don't really need to know what happened several centuries before the story started. An example of that would be when I read The Way of Kings, and I stupidly read the prologue thinking that it had anything to do with the story, which it does, but all of that information gets told to you throughout the 4 books as you're reading them. Even the scene that he sets up at the beginning of that book is fleshed out later on in the story. Because in this, I remember like reading the prologue thinking how confused I was. Like I was kind of bored too. Like I didn't really know what was going on. Nothing is really explained, and that's kind of the nebulous nature of a prologue itself. It's supposed to catch the reader's interest and kind of explain some of the things and build some of the world up, that may have happened way before the story started. Unfortunately, it falls flat for a lot of readers, which is why a lot of people skip prologues. And it's not just me, it's a lot of people that skip the prologues. Obviously, there are people out there that love prologues. I'm not one of them, and a lot of readers are not those types of readers either. Tip number 4 would be to try to keep new character introductions to a bare minimum. So back in my critique partner days, there was this one particular fantasy I read that I still remember to this day. And if I still remember something this awful to this day, it usually means it's not a good thing to put this in the story. It had 10 different characters introduced in the first 4 pages, okay? And it was mostly just names and paragraphs of physical description and what they did for a living, and as well as a boring backstory for each one of them. And I didn't know who the hell the main character was by the time all this was over. And by the time I got to chapter 2, I had already forgotten everyone's names and what they looked like, and I sure as hell wasn't going to go back to reread chapter 1 to figure it all out. If your reader has to keep referencing earlier chapters like a glossary just to keep track of who's who in your fantasy, then this needs to be fixed. If your book has a lot of main characters, like a lot of high fantasies do, then introduce that shit one at a time. Trickle them in. Don't throw every single character at the reader in the first few pages or even in the first chapter. Don't unload that arsenal right away. I'm more likely to remember like who a character is and what they look like if I read an entire scene between that character and another character, while being subtly reminded of like prominent physical traits that they have throughout the book. Of course, I'm not telling you to keep describing every single physical detail throughout the book, but you can restate things like a character's eye color or hair color or physique or skin color, and you can do that in creative ways throughout the story to just remind the reader, what the character may look like. If their physical characteristics are important, like, for example, someone being a giant, or they're missing an eye, or they might be grotesquely fat, then make sure that the reader can imagine those characteristics. So how many people out there knew exactly what Baron Vladimir Harkonnen looked like even before watching the movie? My guess is every single person who actually read Dune. As for everyone else, remember, you don't have to go overboard with the description. Most of your readers will likely end up making up what they think each character looks like anyways, based on their narrative voice or their dialogue choices, or even they may make the character look like themselves in some way. For example, Victor in The Life of Puppets was this thin, long-haired 21-year-old man with dark skin. But in my mind, because of how childlike his dialogue was, he was this like Twinkie sour cream colored 16-year-old boy with short black hair. And that was how he looked in my head the entire story. It wasn't until his skin color was mentioned for like the second time in the book, much later on, almost at the end. Actually, I think it was at the end. I realized I'd really screwed up the mental image of him. I didn't even remember what his age was. I thought he was like either 16 or 18 or something like that. I didn't even know he was that old. I didn't even know he was 21. Even Nurse Ratched in my head looked like Rosie from the Jetsons, who had this sliding compartment door where her tentacles and drills would just magically appear from. So unless your characters have very defining and unique features, it's often not worth repeating them all the time if you don't want to. If the character's appearance is important to you, or it's very important to the story, there's a much better chance of retention if you introduce each of the main characters or each of the side characters slowly and over time. Give us a chance to really get to know these characters, especially the main characters. Tip number 5, avoid too much backstory. Similar to introducing too many characters at once, bogging the reader down with a crapload of backstory at the start is not going to keep them reading. In fact, it's probably going to do the opposite. Now, should a character's backstory be given? If it's interesting and if it's needed, yes. Should it be given in its entirely in the first 8 paragraphs of the first chapter? No. For the love of God, no. Your beginning should establish a setting, an atmosphere, and a character's personality, as well as establishing the character's wants or needs. Okay, these are the things that are important to the story progression. The backstory is the seasoning you sprinkle throughout the first half of the book, or perhaps the backstory becomes more relevant as the climax is revealed later on. Didn't necessarily agree with it, but I'm going to bring up The Way of Kings again. This was kind of done by Brandon Sanderson, where the character's backstory was mostly revealed during the climax in the final battle, which was a choice. Definitely knocked an extra star off for that one, but it seemed to work for a lot of people. So, sometimes the backstory can come later on. Sometimes the backstory can come in the middle. But as long as it's sprinkled throughout the story and not just jammed in the reader's face all at once, you're pretty good. You're pretty good to go with the backstory. Think about it this way. When you meet someone new, do you introduce yourself by asking them about their childhood or what they ate or did last week? Well, if you have any sort of social etiquette at all, no, you wouldn't. So why the hell would you introduce your protagonist to the reader in the same exact way? The reader should be getting to know who they are at the present time. And once that character actually matters to the reader, then we'll want to know more about that character's past. Number 6, use foreshadowing. Now, foreshadowing your inciting incident is another way to keep your reader engaged and asking questions, turning those pages because they know something's about to go down. You could have your main character run into a future romantic interest, and you can foreshadow this by having them, lock eyes or become really pissed off at one another, if it's an enemies to lover type trope. You could describe a found object as having this strange and beautiful design, only to later on have that object become some sort of magical device or ability that changes the main character's life in some way. Now, granted, these are like simple cliche examples, but it kind of gives you an example of what foreshadowing is. It can be something obvious, or it can be something subtle that unsettles the reader. Foreshadowing events to come is a great way to keep your readers hanging off of your every word. And it's a tool you'll start to use more often as you become more experienced with the craft. It's something that, even Stephen King uses a lot in his stories, and it gets you asking questions. It gets you wanting to know what's going to happen next, because these things are often foreshadowed in his books. I use a lot of foreshadowing in my writing. I tend to be a lot more subtle about it, but when, I've often had people, when they, sorry about the yeaning, when they go back and reread my story for the second time, they'll notice things that I sprinkled throughout the beginnings and the middle of the story that foreshadowed events that came later on. They may not have seen it right away, but they'll see it when they go back and read it, or they may remember it. And this is the gift of foreshadowing. You're really engaging the reader in such a way that it's actually enjoyable for them. So never disregard foreshadowing. Keep that in your writer's toolkit. If you're not that good at it, practice it, learn it, read up on how to properly foreshadow things. So those are tips that I have about writing a beginning that has a higher chance of retaining a reader, keeping them hooked. As you keep practicing, you'll start to understand what makes a beginning impactful using your own unique voice and style. Not everything has to be in the style of Aaron Dusk or Stephen King or, I don't know, Stephanie Meyer or Brandon Sanderson. Every author has their own unique way of writing, has their own unique voice, and you have to adapt these specific rules to your own way of doing things. And of course, not everything is hard and fast either. So I'd also like to mention, on that note, I'll mention, there are some genres that usually break these rules or that these tips don't really apply to. So for example, here's a genre that I don't write in and I don't read that often, but I have read some, would be like a murder mystery. Sometimes the murder starts with the main character needing to solve a murder. It can jump right into the action without any lead up, okay? So, and I mean, I've mentioned before that, starting a story with action is uninteresting because we haven't really established who that character is yet. So having the stakes at the very beginning of the book seems unnecessary. Well, in a murder mystery, it's not really the stakes that we're seeing. It's something has happened that needs to be solved. So everything is coming at us a lot sooner, okay? And these books tend to usually be a lot shorter too. Another example within this kind of genre of writing would be a thriller. And they may cast aside that don't introduce too many characters at once rule, because every character is usually introduced pretty quickly in a thriller. And this is because most of these characters are going to end up as fodder anyways. You can sometimes tell which characters are going to live the longest and which ones are going to die the soonest based on how much attention the author gives each character's description. So it's kind of predictable in a way, but it's also kind of foreshadowing in a way too. So think of it that way. This is usually pretty intentional because, like I said before, with murder mysteries, thrillers are shorter and much faster paced. So you want to get those introductions out of the way as fast as possible. So therefore, the tip of introducing each character slowly to get us used to them doesn't really apply to this genre of writing. So yeah, some of these tips may not work with the genres you write in, but it can still give you an overall idea of what agents and readers are usually looking for in a book's beginning. And one important thing to remember, even though the beginning of your story is the most important part and the thing that you're going to end up rewriting the most, don't focus too hard on this advice when you're writing your very first draft. Get what you need to write on paper as fast as possible, okay? Get all of that out, and then worry about the story, worry about the beats later on. Worry about these tips later on. That first draft is always going to be the writer telling the writer themselves the story. It's not for readers. It depends on your style. If you're more experienced and can write a first draft using these tips and keeping readers engaged, then pay more attention to the first tip. But get that draft finished and then worry about the other stuff later. Everything can be revised, everything can be rewritten, but if you're letting analysis paralysis prevent you from ever finishing even chapter 1 because you watched this video and now you're just worried about making everything perfect, then there's really no point of even following the tips because you're not getting any writing done. So that's really all I have for now. If people, like this video, I may go into some examples later on of, bland or bad beginnings from books that may have been published many years ago, but still haven't gotten many likes or many good reviews. So if you like this video, like and subscribe. And as always, I'll see you guys next time. So I just wanted to give a shout out and a thank you to every single one of my patrons out there, and even the people that aren't patrons that have joined my Discord as well. You guys have done more for me than most people have in my life, and it's not just the monetary support. It's been all of the emotional support and all of the well wishes and the words of encouragement that have really kept me going. These last couple months or so, and even though things are still pretty bad right now, and I'm still not sure what's going to happen in the future, I just want you to know that all of the support that you've given me, it's not falling on deaf ears. It really does keep me going, and it keeps me moving forward, and I just really appreciate everything that you guys have done. So thank you.